Hello friends of TV Agro, my name is Camilo Quintero, I am a veterinary internist and equine sports doctor. Today we are in the equestrian forest and we are going to talk about the functional evaluation of the saddle. Why we are going to touch this topic? Because it is extremely important. Actually 80 to 85% of the horses that manifest back pain, generally that pain is associated with problems in the saddle, with balance adjustment in the saddle and even with the way the rider rides. Today, we are going to touch this topic. I hope you like it. The first thing you should ask yourself, is when you buy a horse, when you want a saddle, the first thing a rider should ask themselves is, was that saddle made for the horse? Was it made specifically for the horse? One of the mistakes that are made, is that the manufacture of the saddles is generalized and in the same way that no athlete will run with tennis shoes or shoes that are not your size. It happens with horses. The ideal is that each horse uses a saddle, which is designed specifically for him. The other thing you should always ask yourself is, does the saddle that I had for my previous horse fit the horse I have now? The other thing you should ask yourself is, how often am I having that saddle evaluated? Ideally, the saddle should be evaluated every 6 months and the horse's back should also be evaluated every 6 months. Why? To make corrections in the saddle in a relevant way and to avoid that the horse has pain and that its sporting performance decreases. For this reason, it is also very important to learn to recognize the clinical signs, which occur when the horse is presenting pain at the level of the back caused by the saddle. It is very important to remember that, by the anatomy and biomechanics of the horse, when he begins to present pain in the back, what we will find is mainly a pain in the back. What we are going to find is mainly a shortening in the gait, in the forelegs, a shortening in the cranial phase of the trunk, that is to say the horse loses the ability to direct the limb forward to make a pronation. What we are going to find is that the horse loses the ability to meet with the hind limbs, because they lose the ability to place the hind limbs under the abdomen and thus loses impulsion. Essentially we must observe different muscular structures all related to him with the saddle. Mainly we have to keep in mind that when the horse begins to present a pain in the back, we will generally find a hypertrophy at the level of this muscle, which is the trapezius muscle in the cervical portion. We usually find horses that have too bulky this area and concomitantly have an atrophy in this region, which is the region of the same trapezius muscle but in the thoracic portion. Another clinical sign that we found, is a hypertrophy of the long muscle of the head and long neck. Basically because the horse all the time is trying to lift the head by the same pain that is occurring in the back and is constantly fighting with the mouth. We also begin to find hypertrophy at this level. Another very important finding is an atrophy at the level of the gluteal region and the biceps femoris muscle that are located in this area. Basically because the horse, having pain in this region, loses the ability to propel itself. As we see here, this fascia, as it is the one that gives rise to the dorsal muscles, ends up being affected, and at this level is where we also find the insertion, for example, of the gluteus superficialis muscle. And in this way the horse basically begins to lose the impulsion and we begin to observe how this whole region begins to atrophy. In parallel, a very important finding is that this region back here, the semitendinosus and semimembranosus muscle, begin to hypertrophy. Why? For the same reason that the horse cannot place their limbs under the abdomen to perform the impulsion and thus begin to overexert these muscles to cause the impulsion and begin to hypertrophy. Finally, another of the most common findings in horses that have back pain, is the laxity of the core muscles. This muscle is the rectus abdominis. begins to be observed lax and the abdomen begins to fall basically because the horse all the time is working contracted and strained dorsal muscles. When these core muscles begin to be affected, the horse loses the ability to flex the hip region, loses the ability to flex the spine and flex the lumbosacral region. This is the reason why the horse also loses impulsion and end up being affected all the muscles directly related to impulsion, which are the gluteal muscles and femoral and juicio. We have this muscle that is the latissimus dorsi muscle. This muscle is basically responsible for helping the impulsion of the forelimbs, so that when the horse has pain in this region we lose impulsion from the forelimbs. Now we have this muscle here, which is the serratus muscle. In its thoracic portion, this muscle is in direct contact either with the knee or with the stirrup or with the rider's leg, and this muscle also contributes to the stabilization of the scapula and the impulsion of the forelimb. The next part of the functional evaluation of the saddle is the dynamic part. In this part we make a previous evaluation of the back of the animal. For that we use thermography that will indicate the points that are already inflamed, which are already presenting more heat emission, just by inflammation. Then we do a part outside and with the horse mounted. For that we basically use the saddle to be evaluated. We use a traditional saddle, it can be leather or fabric, we avoid the neoprene ones. Because they will isolate too much the saddle from the back and they will not evoke the same temperature, they will not let us evaluate the pressure points, and then, after exercising the horse with the saddle, normally do the exercise that the horse would normally do for 10 to 15 minutes, we do a recheck with thermography to determine those points where the saddle is exerting inadequate pressure and compare them again with the pressure points or points of heat on the back of the horse. Now we proceed to do the thermography. Now we are doing the thermal image or thermographic. There you will see the image on the screen where the hottest points are the white dots, followed by red dots, yellow, green, aquamarine blue, dark blue. But at the level of the back basically we will find white dots, red dots, yellow dots and green dots. Remember, the white dots are the areas of highest heat emission and are the areas where we will normally find inflammatory processes. In the case of this mare, the distribution is quite homogeneous, which suggests that she has few ailments at the level of the back. We are going to make the evaluation now after using the saddle. Now we are doing the dynamic evaluation where we have to take into account the position of the rider when riding. We will evaluate the position of the shoulders must be very horizontal, the position of the rider's spine with respect to the position of the horse's spine. According to that we will estimate if the rider is overloaded on one side or the other. We also take the opportunity to evaluate the position of the stirrups, that they are absolutely parallel to each other, to avoid overloads. That eventually will result in hot spots at the level of the saddle. During the trot we also evaluate the movement acquired by the saddle and the rider, accompanying the natural movements of the horse. Then we must take into account that the rider must also present some movements that accompany these movements of the horse. Once we finish the dynamic evaluation, we do the evaluation of the mare again, a thermography of the back of the mare to evaluate the points in which the saddle exerted pressure. We proceed to capture the images. In it we observe a hot spot at the thoracic level in the thoracic vertebrae. where you can see that the laser is pointing. And now we proceed to make a correlation with the findings in the saddle. Now we do the thermography of the saddle, where we find a hot spot at the level of the saddle tunnel. The canes are quite well balanced. We only find that the left vastus, which is the one that you see in the right position, is slightly hotter than the left vastus, which suggests some pressure, perhaps from the rider more on the left side. We find that the point of greater heat at the level of the saddle tunnel is concomitant with the point of greater pressure or heat that we find at the level of the back. What we should do in this case is to take the saddle to the saddler and ask him to remove the pressure point that we observed, and also ask him to make a compensation and a proper evaluation of the two vastus, to make a rebulging of the vastus so that they are symmetrical. Anyway, as we can see in this saddle, it does not necessarily have to do with a bad position of the rider, it can also be of the saddle. As we observed in this saddle, the left vastus is a vastus that is much more bulging than the right vastus, so that the left vastus is much more bulging than the right vastus, in such a way that the left vastus is more bulging than the right vastus, so that the left vastus is exerting more pressure and for the same reason also generates more heat. When we take the saddle to the saddler, we ask him to make a proper adaptation, a leveling of the two vastus, and to correct the pressure points that we leave marked with tape, specifically where they are originating, and in essence there ends the functional evaluation of the saddle, where we end up locating the points of greater pressure and the points that may be generating pain in the back and the bad positions of the rider. Well, friends of TV Agro, this was all for today. Remember that my name is Camilo Quintero. I am a veterinary internist and equine sports doctor. I can advise you on everything you need for your high-performance horses. My social networks: on Instagram you can find me as at vet.equino.camilo on Facebook as Camilo Quintero Equine Veterinarian, and my phone is 320-49-9-1876. Remember that the evaluation of the saddle and the evaluation of the rider should be done by a professional, a person with experience, and should always have the professional guidance to get better results and that your horse all the performance that you intend. Until a next opportunity.